The 80s by starting in the news area, and when it came time to think of the top 10 stories that made news in the 80s, who better to choose than the guy who told us about them throughout the 80s, our good buddy John Palmer. Welcome back, John.
Thanks, Brian. Good morning.
Now, this list you came up with, what criteria did you use?
Well, I was looking for the most, really the most important events that affected our lives, either events or trends in the last decade. It was very difficult. It was a momentous decade, as you well know.
We tend to forget sometimes how far back it reaches. I mean, I'm sure you've got some in this that we go, did that happen in the 80s? Because it seems like ancient history.
That's right. I started out, as you requested, coming back to the forward, starting with number 10. And my number 10 is an economic story, and that's the rise of Japan from an economic power to a political power. Japan entered the decade certainly with a lot of economic power, but they were very skillful in changing this, transforming it to political power. They're very much on the world stage as a political as well as an economic power. And then there's communication. I chose as number 9. We have our cellular telephones, our fax machines. There was the breakup of AT&T, the baby bells, microwave satellites, and so forth. Quite a revolution there.
So you're on the generic theme now.
That's right. That's right.
Japan is 10, communications is 9. Go ahead. What's 8?
Now, while we're still with the economy, there were some major economic changes in this country. Of course, there was the Wall Street crash. There's an important trend, I think. We found that a lot of people were using money to make money instead of to make products. There's a lot of talk of greed during the decade of the 80s, of takeovers, of junk bonds, and so forth. Not a very good trend there. And of course, there were the tragedies. The Challenger touched our lives. The assassination of John Lennon, Bhopal, Chernobyl, the earthquakes, of course, Pan Am 103. But certainly, I think most, wouldn't you think, it was the Challenger with the death of one of the astronauts being a school teacher that so affected our lives.
Certainly, it changed a 20-year outlook that we had toward space. Maybe
we've gotten very blasé about the whole aspect.
Let's go to number 6.
Number 6, the homeless, another trend. We certainly had homeless at the beginning of the decade, but it grew. It became not just a problem in the big cities like New York and Chicago and Los Angeles. You find the homeless now all over the United States, even in rural areas. There's another plague on our society, the plague of AIDS. Back when we first began the decade, just about 200 Americans had died of AIDS in 1980 and 81. Now 60,000 Americans have died of AIDS. That's more than died during the entire Vietnam War, the Americans who died during the war.
What scares you is that has the potential to make the top 10 in the 90s, too.
Yes, indeed it does.
The numbers.
I don't want to stay on the down track here, but we got another big problem, obviously maybe the biggest of all of these, and that's the drug problem.
Number 4.
Number 4 that really took off during the decade of the 1980s. We saw it go from marijuana and heroin to cocaine to crack, and of course the new thing that everybody is talking about is ice, that may be even more addictive than crack. The 8 years certainly of the Reagan presidency will be very important. On the upside, we had the longest amount of sustained economic growth in our lifetime. And the downside, we went from a creditor nation to the largest debtor nation in the world with this huge deficit that we have.
Unfortunately, you've named another one that figures to make it when you come back here in 1999 when we do this.
Yeah, yes, indeed.
Yeah, give me number 2.
All right, number 2, I would have to say the advent of Mikhail Gorbachev on the international scene, his far-reaching reforms of glasnost and perestroika. I think his presence certainly helped what has happened in Eastern Europe. And that brings us to number 1, the disintegration of communism, the most important development, in my view, of this decade. First there was Poland, and then it spread to East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. And who would have guessed just this past Christmas time that the hottest Christmas gift under the tree would be a chunk of the Berlin Wall?
I'm surprised China didn't make your top 10.
Well, it's there. Certainly, I would really group that into the revolution that started. Unfortunately, theirs got pulled back very tortuously and dramatically. And of course, there's the situation in Panama, which we're going to have to see how that plays out in the coming year.
Last note, and I asked each of you to do this too. Your man of the decade
I would have to say it is Mikhail Gorbachev for what he has done in the last half of the decade of the 80s, and certainly he's going to be the man of the 90s.
John Palmer, it's always a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure.
See you, my friend. Happy New Year.
Good luck.
We're back in a moment. This is Today on NBC.